The first thing you notice, looking up on a clear night, is how clean it all seems. That's the lie they never bothered to correct. Stars everywhere, the faint smear of the Milky Way if you're far enough from the cities. Maybe a satellite crawling slow and steady from horizon to horizon. Looks empty, looks vast, looks like something that could absorb anything you threw at it. That's what they thought too, when they watched us from whatever angle they use. They watched us throw things at it for 70 years. They watched us fill the sky with dead steel and shattered circuit boards and frozen fuel and the rusted skeletons of every ambition we'd ever dared to launch. They watched us build a minefield out of our own carelessness, 17,000 kilometers an hour per fragment, too small to track, too fast to dodge, countless and multiplying. They watched us do it, and then they decided that meant we were finished. Oksana Shevchenko had been tracking the cluster designated JB7 for 4 months when the Vascori made their first contact. Not with her. They didn't contact individual humans. They contacted the kind of people who sit in rooms with flags behind them, the kind of people who had never personally done anything in orbit, but who nevertheless believed they owned it. The Vascori were efficient like that. They found the decision makers and they delivered their assessment and they gave what they called a fair timeline. The assessment was this: your orbital shell is compromised beyond autonomous recovery. The cascade has already begun. Within 18 months, low Earth orbit will be impassable. Your species will be permanently confined to the surface of your world. We have observed this pattern 11 times in other systems. We are offering you passage, a limited number of individuals, to a preserved colony site because we are not entirely without mercy. The timeline was 60 days. Oksana heard about it the way most people did, through the kind of leak that happens when a room full of people who were told not to tell anyone individually decide that everyone else deserves to know. She was in the Aerospace Corporation cafeteria in El Segundo when her phone lit up with 17 messages in 4 minutes, and the television over the coffee station switched from a weather report to an emergency broadcast. She had a cup of bad coffee in one hand and a printout of JB7's decay projections in the other. She finished the coffee. She looked at the printout. She thought about the cluster, the specific geometry of it, the way pieces of a dead Russian reconnaissance satellite from 1987 had been slowly drifting into a resonance pattern with the remnants of a Chinese weather satellite that had fragmented in 2007, how the intersection probability had been from each pass, each day, each week's, each building towards something that the models said was not if but when. Then she went back to her desk and called William Ayler. "You've seen it," she said. "I've seen it," he said. He sounded tired. He sounded the way you sound when you've been warning people about something for 30 years. And the thing finally happens, but it's worse than you imagined. The Vascori numbers are actually close. They've modeled it better than most of our internal projections. The cascade is real, Oksana. It's already self-sustaining in certain altitude bands. She spread the printout on her desk. JB7 stared back at her in numbers. "Then we don't argue about whether they're right," she said. "We argue about whether they're right that we can't fix it." There was a pause. She could hear him breathing. Outside her window, somewhere over the Pacific, a fragment the size of a thumbnail was moving at 7 kilometers per second. "They said 11 other civilizations," he said. "I heard them. 11 for 11. I heard that too. And you're not. Bill," she smoothed the printout with the flat of her hand. How many of those 11 civilizations had Don Kessler sitting in a conference room in Houston for the last 4 decades telling them exactly how this would happen and exactly what they'd need to do about it, and nobody listened, and now we're going to go ahead and listen? Another pause. Longer. "Get on a plane," he said. "There's a meeting tomorrow in Houston. Bring the JB7 data. Bring everything." The Vascori didn't understand the meeting. They had representatives on Earth by then, tall and jointless, the color of old carbon, their sensory organs arranged in a cluster just below the crown of their skulls. They had translators, not electronic but biological, creatures that hung from their torsos and processed language into the chemical-acoustic hybrid the Vascori used to communicate. They attended the Houston meeting because they believed they should document the process, the way humans organize their end. What they observed was 47 engineers in folding chairs arguing about harpoons, not metaphorically. Actual harpoons, tethered harpoons, technically the kind you could fire at a tumbling piece of debris and use to drag it into a lower orbit where atmospheric drag would do the rest. Dan Mooney from the Aerospace Corporation had built a scale model, foam and wire, and he was waving it at a projection screen, while a woman named Yoshida from JAXA was explaining that the tumble rates on the larger debris objects were a fundamental problem, that a rigid tether would transmit rotational energy and potentially destabilize the retrieval spacecraft. And Mooney was saying, yeah, okay, but what if we used a flexible tether with a damping mechanism? A specific damping coefficient he'd calculated on a napkin he was now unfolding with his teeth because both hands were occupied with the harpoon model. The lead Vascori representative processed all of this. It relayed a question through its translator. Why are they discussing implementation details? They have not yet acknowledged that the situation is unrecoverable. Oksana Shevchenko was sitting 2 rows back. She'd flown in overnight, and she hadn't slept, and she had a paper cup of coffee that was somehow worse than the one in El Segundo. She heard the translation. She said, without turning around, "We don't do that." The Vascori representative angled its sensory cluster toward her. Clarify. We don't acknowledge that things are unrecoverable. It's not in the vocabulary. We skip it. She took a sip of the terrible coffee. We go straight to implementation details. It's a cultural defect, probably. Or maybe it's a survival mechanism, hard to tell from the inside. She turned back to the projection screen, where Mooney had somehow acquired a second model and was now demonstrating a 2-harpoon simultaneous approach, which Yoshida was objecting to on the grounds of collision probability, which Mooney was dismissing by pointing at the napkin. The Vascori representative was silent for a long moment. Its translator shifted against its torso. 11 civilizations, it said. So I've heard, Oksana said. Were any of them us? No answer. She hadn't really expected one. The plan they built in the end was not elegant. Oksana would have been the first to say so. She'd been in the business long enough to know that the elegant solutions existed in papers, in theoretical frameworks, in presentations at conferences where everyone nodded and agreed that yes, laser ablation was a beautiful idea. Yes, electrodynamic tethers had real potential. Yes, in a perfect world with unlimited budget and 20 years of runway, you could design something that would look good in a museum someday. They didn't have 20 years. They had 16 months, now, after the 2 months they'd already spent arguing. So they built something ugly. They built it out of spare parts, essentially. Existing spacecraft bus designs with new capture mechanisms bolted on. A combination of the tethered harpoon approach and a net system that Yoshida's team had originally developed for a different mission entirely. Ground-based radar augmented with 3 new CubeSats launched on a commercial rocket that Musk's people had turned around in 26 days, which was not a record, but was close. International coordination that would have been diplomatically impossible a year earlier, that somehow became possible when the alternative was permanent confinement to one planet. The Russians contributed their debris tracking data, 40 years of it, some of it from satellites that were now themselves part of the debris field. The Europeans contributed the clear space tether design. The Americans contributed launch capacity and Oksana's team's targeting algorithms. The Chinese contributed something no one expected. They contributed Li Wei. Li Wei was 41 years old and had been working on orbital debris mitigation for the China National Space Administration since she was 27. She had the specific look of someone who had been correct about important things for a very long time and had been largely ignored, which is a look that involves a particular kind of patience, not the peaceful kind, but the tectonic kind, the patience of things that are building pressure. She arrived in Houston with a hard drive containing 14 years of unpublished modeling data and a presentation that she gave on the second day of the joint technical session that lasted 3 hours and involved mathematics that made several of the American engineers stop taking notes and just sit there with their mouths slightly open. What she had done over 14 years was map the cascade, not just where it was, but where it was going. Not just the tracked objects, but the untracked population, estimated from the statistical signatures of hypervelocity, impacts on surfaces that had been in orbit. She had a picture of the debris field that was more complete than anything anyone else had assembled, and she had a sequence. If you remove these objects, she said, pointing to a cluster on the screen, then this orbital band stabilizes. If you remove these, the cascade propagation slows by 60% in this altitude range. You don't have to clean up everything. You have to clean up the right things, in the right order, fast enough that the cascade doesn't outpace you. She had a list, 17 objects, 17 specific pieces of debris, the keystones of the whole unstable structure. 17 things that, if you grabbed them fast enough and dragged them down into the atmosphere, would change the math from impossible to merely brutal. The room was very quiet when she finished. Mooney said, "How long have you had this?" "The current version, about 2 years. The previous version, 8. The quiet got quieter. "I sent papers," Leeway said. "Several papers. The journal said the methodology was interesting, but the conclusions were overstated. I sent the data to 3 agency collaboration programs. The response time was..." She paused, seemed to select a word carefully. "Slow," Oksana said from the back of the room. "You could have." "I know," Leeway said. She said it without heat, without accusation, just as a fact. "Yes, I know." She clicked to the next slide. "Should we discuss the mission architecture?" The Vascori observed all of this. Their lead representative, who Oksana had started privately thinking of as the auditor, attended most of the technical sessions. It rarely asked questions. It watched. Occasionally it consulted with its translator in the chemical acoustic way, which produced a faint smell like ozone and citrus that everyone in the room had stopped noticing after the first week. On the 37th day of the joint session, the auditor spoke up during a discussion of capture system deployment sequencing. It said, "You are proceeding as though this is solvable." Mooney, who was at the whiteboard, said, "Yeah. You have been told with supporting data that 11 civilizations at comparable technological stages were unable to recover from this failure mode." "Yeah, we heard that. You do not find that statistically persuasive?" Mooney thought about it. He put the cap back on his marker. "See, here's the thing," he said. "Those 11 civilizations. Were they trying to fix it, or did they just decide they couldn't and take your exit offer?" A pause. The ozone citrus smell. The offer was made after it was determined that recovery was impossible. How was that determined? By assessment, modeling. The same mathematics that shows your current cascade is self-sustaining. Uh-huh. Mooney uncapped the marker again. Did any of them have Leeway's model? No answer. Yoshida, from across the table, said softly, "That's not really the point, Mooney." "No, I think it is, actually." He went back to the whiteboard. "Look, 11 other civilizations, we believe you. We're not saying you made it up. But 11 samples is not a lot of samples, and sample bias is real, and, more importantly, we don't know what any of those 11 civilizations actually did. We just know the outcome." He drew a circle on the board, put an X through it. "What we're doing is different. It might not work. Probably we'll have a more complete understanding of how it doesn't work when we're done. But we're not making the same assumption you keep making." "What assumption is that?" Mooney looked at him directly. "That knowing it's hard is the same as knowing it's impossible. We're not set up to think that way. It's the one cognitive failure mode we managed to avoid." He tapped the board. "Now, Capture System Deployment Sequencing. We were on Object 4. They launched the first mission on day 91, not because it was ready. Nothing was ready. Exactly. But the Cascade models said day 91 was when a chain reaction in the 780-kilometer band became self-sustaining at a rate that would outpace anything they launched after that. So they launched on day 91 with a system that was 83% tested, with a capture mechanism that had been validated in ground simulation, but not in actual orbital conditions, with a crew of 2 aboard the retrieval bus who understood the odds and had signed a great many forms saying they understood the odds. The crew was a Japanese astronaut named Tanaka Hiroshi and Oksana Shevchenko. Her supervisor had told her she didn't have to go. She had looked at him with the expression of someone who has just been told something so obviously incorrect that she isn't sure how to respond with appropriate politeness. Someone has to validate the capture mechanism on site, she said. I know it better than anyone. The crew can. Tanaka is the pilot. I'm the engineer. This is what engineers are for. She picked up her bag. Also, honestly, I have been looking at this problem for 15 years and I would like to personally watch some of it get fixed. She was not wrong on any of those points. Her supervisor let her go. The debris field from inside it was nothing like the simulations. The simulations gave you dots and tracks and collision probability cones, everything clean and color-coded and safely abstract. The reality was that you were moving through a volume that contained, somewhere, pieces of 50 years of human ambition and carelessness, and you couldn't see most of them. And the radar gave you warnings in the form of numbers that updated every 6 seconds, and you had 6 seconds to decide if the number meant you needed to fire the thrusters. Tanaka flew. Oksana watched the capture system readouts and talked to Houston, and occasionally, in the gaps between critical operations, looked out the viewport. On the second day, tracking a specific piece of the old Russian satellite that was the first target on Liwei's list, she saw it. It was smaller than she'd expected. A curved section of solar panel, about 40 centimeters across, tumbling at a rate of about 2 rotations per second, and as she watched it, catching and releasing the sunlight with each rotation, she thought about the engineer who had built it. Someone in Baikonur, probably, in the early 80s. Someone who had cared about it, who had fit those solar cells into that panel with something approaching pride, who had watched it launch and tracked it for as long as it transmitted, and then written it off and moved on. The thing had been up here for nearly 40 years. It was going to go home in fire 30 minutes after they harpooned it. You ready? Tanaka said. You're not erasing the capture sequence, she said. Hold current attitude. She fired the harpoon. It missed. The Vascori auditor learned about the miss at roughly the same time as Houston, which was 12 minutes after it happened due to signal propagation. It processed the information through its translator. It asked, through the mission liaison who had been assigned to keep it informed, whether this represented a terminal failure. The mission liaison, a young woman from JPL named Reyes, who had been doing this job for 93 days and had developed a specific facial expression for dealing with the auditor's questions, said, no, the capture system failed. The first attempt failed. Tanaka is repositioning for a second approach. It takes about 40 minutes to match orbits again. And if the second attempt fails, third approach. We have fuel for 11 approaches on this object. The auditor was quiet, the ozone citrus smell. You designed the system with 11 redundant attempts. We designed it with 11 attempts. We don't call them redundant, we call them the plan. The auditor processed this. In our assessment of failed recovery efforts, this behavioral pattern, I'm going to stop you there, Reyes said, in the tone she developed specifically for this. Pleasant, but absolute. We're not interested in the assessment right now. The assessment is based on civilizations that didn't have this specific crew on this specific approach vector, with this specific harpoon design that we modified based on what we learned from the first. We're interested in the second attempt. I'll let you know how it goes." She turned back to her screens. The second attempt hit. They got 12 of the 17 in the first 6 weeks. Not clean. Nothing was clean. Object 7 required 4 attempts and a manual spacewalk that was not in the plan, and that gave everyone in Houston a collectively elevated heart rate for 4 hours. Object 11 turned out to have fragmented since Leeway's data, so they were dealing with a cluster of 9 pieces instead of one intact object, and they had to improvise a net approach that worked on 6 of the 9 and left 3 pieces in a lower energy orbit where the atmospheric drag would get them in about 18 months, which was not ideal, but was within the acceptable parameters of the model. Object 13 was a NASA satellite from 2001, and there was a moment when Oksana was positioning the harpoon on the capture run when she read the designation off the hull and recognized it. She had written a paper about this satellite. She had used its data in her dissertation. It had been part of her world in a very particular way for 20 years, and now it was debris, tumbling at 2.5 rotations per second, and she was going to end it. She fired the harpoon, on target, clean capture. She watched the tether go taut and thought about what it meant to close accounts with things that had served their purpose. Tanaka, who had learned over 6 weeks to read her silences, said nothing. In the 63rd day of the mission, the Cascade models were updated. Leeway ran the new numbers with the 12 removals factored in. She presented the results to the joint session and to the Vascori auditor simultaneously, because at that point there was really no reason to keep separate briefings. The Cascade propagation rate in the 780-kilometer band had decreased by 38%. It was not enough. They needed the remaining 5 objects, and 2 of them were in degraded orbits that made approach geometry difficult, and they had a crew in space who had been there for 63 days and were getting to the far end of the consumables window. Leeway said, "We need the last 5, and we need them in the next 40 days, and here is why the order matters." She pointed to Object 14, a piece of Chinese Long March 3rd stage from 1994. In a slowly decaying orbit, big, dense, highly radar visible. It was going to come down on its own in about 6 years. Normally, you'd leave it alone, but it's going to intersect this cluster here, pointed she, in 43 days. When it does, we get secondary fragmentation in this altitude band, and then we're chasing a new population, and the math gets bad again. We need to intercept it and change its decay timeline, pull it down faster than 6 years. Someone said, "Can we do that without capturing it? Just a propulsive nudge to shift the orbit?" Leeway said, "Yes, we attach a drag device, small. One of the CubeSats, modified, acting as an aerodynamic brake. We dock it to Object 14, increase the drag cross-section, and let the atmosphere do the work. It comes down in 4 months instead of 6 years before the intersection." Mooney said, "We've never docked a CubeSat to a debris object." Leeway said, "No. But we can design the interface tonight." They designed the interface that night. The auditor asked to speak with Oksana directly on day 71. It was a formal request, transmitted through the mission liaison, and it was unusual enough that Houston approved it and patched through a direct channel. There was a delay of just over half a second each way, which made conversation awkward but not impossible. The auditor said, "You understand that even if you succeed with the remaining objects, the debris field will continue to grow through natural processes, future launches, operational failures, ASAT tests, if your political situation remains unstable." Oksana was looking at the viewport. Earth below, the Terminator line cutting across the Indian Ocean, the shadow side bright with city lights in a way that always surprised her. "Yes," she said. "Then your solution is temporary. You stabilize the Cascade now, but without permanent changes to how your civilization manages orbital space. You will reach this threshold again." Huh. Probably. 11 civilizations. You know, I've been thinking about that. She turned from the viewport. 11 civilizations. And every time you offered the exit. Every time you showed up and told them it was unrecoverable and here's the door. And they took it. All 11. The mathematics. I'm not arguing the mathematics. I'm asking a different question. She settled into her seat. Did showing up change things? Did the offer of the exit make it easier to stop trying? Because that's what we're not doing. Nobody has taken your exit. Not one government, not one person has said, fine, we'll go. Everyone is still here, working the problem. That's different. That's not a small different. That's a... She searched for the word, a structural different. The ozone citrus smell, even through the comms link, seemed present somehow. She knew it wasn't. She was imagining it. You believe your species is exceptional, the auditor said. No, I believe your sample is biased by your offer. If you show someone a life raft, some of them will stop swimming. That's not because swimming was impossible. That's because the raft was there. She looked back at the window. We didn't have a raft. We had each other's worst models and a harpoon design that needed 11 tries to work and Li Wei's 14 years of ignored data. That's what we had. A long delay, longer than the signal propagation explained. Object 15, the auditor said finally. Your approach geometry is suboptimal. We have navigational data from our orbital assets that may improve your intercept window by 11 minutes. Oksana said carefully, that would be helpful. We will transmit it. She didn't say thank you. She had the sense that thanks was not the right currency for whatever was happening. She said, received, we'll use it. She went back to work. They got all 5. Object 14 with the CubeSat break, which was exactly as improvised in practice as it had been on the drawing board, which is to say it involved Tanaka holding the modified CubeSat against the debris surface, while Oksana used a probe to fire the attachment pins, manually because the automated system couldn't compensate for the object's tumble rate, and it was the most careful thing she had ever done with her hands. And when the pins seated and the connection confirmed, and she let go and floated back and the CubeSat began to pull its aerodynamic shadow across the debris object's orbit, she felt something shift in her chest that she didn't have a name for. Object 15 with the Viscori navigation data, which bought them the 11 minutes and meant they had enough fuel for the approach. Object 16 with the net system, which worked on the first try, which was not expected. Object 17 in the last possible window, 11 hours before the Cascade intersection Li Wei had been tracking for 6 weeks, Tanaka threading the retrieval bus through a gap in the debris distribution that the radar said was there, and the visibility said was not there, and then it was there, and they caught it, and the tether held. On day 106, Oksana Shevchenko floated in front of the viewport with a thermal mug of the best coffee the ISS had in stock, which was not excellent coffee, but was better than anything from the cafeteria in El Segundo, and looked at the earth below. The debris field was still there, would be there for years, in diminished form, tracking down through the atmosphere in the timescales that physics allowed. New debris would accumulate. New rules would have to be written, and some of them would be enforced and some would not, and the problem would require attention in ways that were permanent and unglamorous, and that no one would ever make a documentary about. But the cascade had stopped. Li Wei's updated model, run on the morning of day 106, showed a propagation rate of 0 in the critical altitude bands. Stable, not clean, not solved forever, but stable, for now, for long enough, for the definition of long enough, that humans in folding chairs and in orbital transfer vehicles and in 14-year databases of ignored data had decided collectively was sufficient. The auditor's final transmission to the joint session had been brief. We will update our models, it said. Nobody applauded. The room was too tired for applause, and anyway it wasn't that kind of room. But Mooney had smiled, and Reyes had made a note in her log, and Li Wei had sat very still for a moment with the expression of someone who has been carrying something a long time and has just set it down. Oksana had not been there. She'd been in space, finishing the work. She looked out at the bright crescent of the earth, the lights on the shadow side, the stars above that were as clean and indifferent as they had always been. The sky that looked empty wasn't empty. It never had been. That was the thing no one had understood until they had no choice but to understand it. The sky was a place, and places could be damaged, and damaged places could sometimes be brought back if you refused, with a stubbornness that bordered on stupidity, to accept that they couldn't. She finished the coffee. She started writing the deorbit burn checklist. There was more work to do. There was always more work to do. That was the part nobody put in the documentaries either. Not the victory, if you could call it that, but the morning after, when the problem wasn't solved but was merely different, and you picked up the new version of it and started again. She picked up the new version of it and started again.